Power in England was never held by kings alone. For 2.5 centuries, much of it belonged to the de la Poles. They began as wool merchants in a small port town on the Yorkshire coast, men who weighed fleeces and counted coins while the great lords rode to war. They had no ancient name, no coat of arms, no seat in any parliament. But they had money, and in a kingdom always at war, money was the one thing kings could never do without. Through their wealth, their cunning, and a willingness to gamble everything on the favour of the crown, they rose, generation by generation, from the wharves of Hull to the corridors of Westminster, from merchants to earls, from earls to dukes, and finally, through one extraordinary marriage, into the royal blood of the Plantagenets themselves. And then the Tudors came. And one by one, the de la Poles were hunted, imprisoned, exiled, and killed, until the last of them died on a battlefield in Italy, fighting for a foreign king, still dreaming of the English throne he would never hold. Tonight, we tell the whole story of their long and extraordinary rise, and their slow and violent fall, slowly and softly, to ease you into sleep. Welcome and rest easy. You've found Sleepy Nobles. If this is your first night with us, consider yourself one of the household now. And if you've sat with us before, it's good to have you back by the fire. So lower the lights, rest your head, and let the cares of the day fall away. Tonight, we quietly open the doors of the House of de la Pole and tell their whole story, their rise, their power, and their place in history, unhurried and gentle to carry you softly into sleep. There is a stretch of coastline on the eastern edge of Yorkshire where the land meets the North Sea in a thin, curving arm of sand called Spurn Point. It is a desolate and beautiful place, shaped by centuries of tide and wind, and it has always been shifting, the sea giving ground in one season and taking it back in the next. In the late 13th century, there stood near the tip of this peninsula a small harbour town called Ravensor, sometimes written as Ravensor Odd. It was a place of fishermen and merchants, a port of modest trade, where ships came and went with the turning of the seasons. And it was here, according to tradition, that the story of the de la Pole family begins. We say tradition because the truth of the family's earliest origins has been lost to us. In the summer of 1381, during the violent upheaval known as the Peasants' Revolt, the family's private papers and records were destroyed. Whatever documents once traced the de la Poles back to their roots, birth records, deeds, early business contracts, were consumed in the fires of that rebellion, and they have never been recovered. What we are left with is a name, a place, and the broad outlines of a family that rose from nothing. The name itself, de la Pole, suggests a connection to the word pool, perhaps referring to a geographical feature near their home, a creek or harbour pool near the coast. Some later genealogists attempted to connect the family to a noble Welsh line, the de la Poles of Mordwy in Powys, but there is no credible evidence for this link, and most historians treat it as a flattering invention from a later era, when the family was eager to prove that their blood had always been distinguished. The reality, as far as we can tell, is rather more humble. The de la Poles were ordinary people, traders, merchants, people who worked with their hands and lived by the tides. What we know with reasonable certainty is that by the early years of the 14th century, two brothers, William and Richard de la Pole, had established themselves as wool merchants in the growing port of Kingston upon Hull, the town we now call simply Hull. They may have come from Ravensor, as the tradition holds, or they may have been born in Hull itself. Either way, Hull was where their fortunes were made. The town had been granted its royal charter by Edward I in 1299, and it was rapidly becoming one of the most important trading ports on England's eastern coast. Wool, England's great medieval commodity, flowed out through its docks to the markets of Flanders and beyond, and wine and other goods flowed back in. It was a place where an ambitious merchant could grow rich, and the de la Pole brothers were nothing if not ambitious. By 1317, both William and Richard held positions as deputies of the royal chief butler in Hull, overseeing the import of wine into the port. It was an office that placed them at the nexus of trade and governance, controlling what came in, what went out, and who profited from the exchange. Between 1321 and 1324, they served as chamberlains of the town, in effect, the men who managed its finances and its commercial affairs. It was not a glamorous position, but it was a powerful one, because in a port town like Hull, the man who controlled the money controlled everything. During this same period, William was exporting increasing quantities of wool from Hull, building a trade network that stretched across the North Sea to the great cloth markets of Flanders, to Bruges, Ghent, and Ypres, where English wool was spun into the fine textiles that clothed the wealthy of Europe. Wool was England's great export commodity in the 14th century, the foundation of the kingdom's wealth and the principal source of royal revenue through the customs duties that were charged on its export. A man who controlled the wool trade in a major port like Hull was not merely a merchant, he was a figure of national economic importance, because the flow of wool from England to Flanders was one of the arteries through which the lifeblood of the English economy moved. William understood this, and he used it. He built relationships not only with the Flemish buyers who purchased his wool, but with the English crown, which depended on the customs revenue that the wool trade generated. He was not yet a great man by the standards of the kingdom. He was not a knight, not a lord, not even a gentleman in the formal sense. But he was becoming wealthy, and in the England of the early 14th century, wealth had a way of attracting the attention of kings. The king at that time was Edward II, a weak and troubled ruler whose reign was defined by political crisis, baronial rebellion, and, ultimately, deposition. Edward needed money, as English kings almost always did, to finance his wars and his court, and William de la Pole was increasingly in a position to provide it. Records from 1325 show loans of £1,800 and £1,000 made by William to the crown in connection with the conflict over Gascony. Enormous sums for a provincial merchant, and sums that would have been inconceivable for a man of William's station just a generation earlier. But it was the fall of Edward II and the rise of his young son, Edward III, that truly transformed the family's fortunes. The new king came to the throne in 1327, and almost immediately England was at war, first with Scotland, then with France. These wars were expensive. They demanded ships, supplies, soldiers, and above all, money. And William de la Pole, now firmly established as one of the wealthiest merchants in the north of England, was ready to provide all of these things. Hull became a staging ground for the Scottish campaigns. William supplied the army with provisions and arranged ships and men for transport. His loans to the crown grew larger and more frequent. He was no longer simply a merchant. He was becoming a financier, a man whose wealth was woven into the fabric of royal policy. And as his importance grew, so did his influence. In 1330, he obtained the royal manor of Myton, a significant landed estate that marked his first step from the world of trade into the world of property and lordship. Then, in 1332, came the moment that would symbolize the family's transformation more than any other. Edward III visited Hull, and William entertained the king himself, hosting the monarch in his own home, a distinction that few merchants in England could claim. In return, Edward granted William the title of Mayor for the Chief Magistrate of Hull, and William became the first man to hold that office. He would serve as mayor for 4 years until 1335, and during his tenure, the town grew in stature and importance. But William de la Pole was reaching for something far greater than civic office. He represented Hull in Parliament on multiple occasions during the 1330s, sitting as a member for the borough and gaining experience of national politics. He negotiated with Flanders on behalf of the crown, using his mercantile connections to serve as a diplomat. And all the while he continued to pour money into the king's wars. Money that came with interest rates as high as 22%, enriching the de la Poles even as it drained the royal treasury. It was a breathtaking rise. The Chronicle of Meaux, a contemporary record kept by the monks of a nearby abbey, described William de la Pole as second to no merchant of England. And that was precisely what he was, a man who had risen higher than any English merchant before him, who had turned wool and wine into political power, and who was now on the threshold of something that no one in his family had ever imagined, a place among the nobility of the realm. But the very thing that had made him powerful, his closeness to the king, was about to become the source of his first great crisis, because Edward III, for all his greatness, was a king who used men up. And when the money ran out, he had a habit of turning on the men who had lent it. The relationship between William de la Pole and Edward III was, at its heart, a bargain, one that enriched both sides but that rested on a foundation of mutual dependency that could, at any moment, collapse. William lent the king money. The king in return granted William influence, offices, and landed estates. But borrowing on this scale was unsustainable, and by the late 1330s, the arrangement was beginning to strain. The war with France, which would come to be known as the 100 Years' War, had begun in earnest in 1337, and it was consuming resources at an extraordinary rate. Edward needed a steady supply of cash to fund his armies on the continent, and he had turned not only to William de la Pole, but to a range of English merchants and financiers, organising them into syndicates that pooled their resources to fund the crown. The most important of these was the English Wool Company, a monopoly that controlled the export of wool and channeled the profits toward the war effort. William de la Pole was at the centre of this system. Along with his brother Richard and other wealthy merchants, he managed the flow of wool and money that kept the English armies in the field. It was an enormously powerful position, but it was also an enormously exposed one. If the system worked, everyone prospered. If it failed, someone would have to take the blame. In 1340, the system failed. Edward III, furious at what he saw as the mismanagement of his finances and the inability of his backers to keep pace with the cost of the war, returned to England in a rage. He needed someone to blame, and he found his targets among the very men who had bankrolled his campaigns. William de la Pole, along with his brother Richard and the merchant Sir John de Pulteney, were arrested. William was charged in connection with the failure of the English Wool Company and imprisoned at Devizes Castle in Wiltshire. His lands were seized. His wealth, which he had spent decades building, was suddenly at the mercy of a furious king. It was the first time the family had experienced the dark side of royal favour, the terrible truth that the same hand that lifted you up could, without warning, bring you crashing down. William had gambled everything on his relationship with the crown, and now the crown had turned against him. And yet, remarkably, William survived. The charges against him were annulled in 1344, and within a year he was back at work. Organising new companies, arranging new loans, rebuilding the financial machinery that the king depended on. It was a testament to his resilience, but also to his indispensability. Edward might punish his financiers in a moment of anger, but he could not do without them. The war continued, and the war needed money, and William de la Pole was still one of the few men in England who could provide it. His brother Richard did not live to see the family's recovery. Richard de la Pole died in 1345, leaving William as the sole head of the family enterprise. But William pressed on, and through the late 1340s and 1350s, he continued to serve the crown, lending, trading, negotiating, while also consolidating his position as one of the most important landowners in Yorkshire. There were further clashes with the king. During a period of peace in the 1350s, Edward renewed old charges of wool smuggling against William, and in an extraordinary act of financial surrender, William was forced to sign a document in 1354, cancelling all of the king's debts to him, every penny that the crown owed, in exchange for a royal pardon. It was a bitter price to pay, but William paid it. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that in medieval England survival sometimes mattered more than justice. In his later years, William turned his attention to legacy. He had spent a lifetime acquiring wealth, and now he wanted to turn that wealth into something that would outlast him, something that would give the de la Pole name a permanence that no amount of gold or political influence could provide. In 1350, he founded a hospital in Hull, the Maison Dieu, a charitable institution that would serve the sick and the poor for generations to come. It was an act of piety, but also of calculation, because in medieval England, the founding of religious and charitable houses was one of the surest ways for a wealthy man to secure his reputation and his salvation. The church would pray for the soul of its founder, and the community would remember the man who had provided for the needy. And shortly before his death, he obtained a license from Edward III to found a Carthusian priory in Hull, the monastery that would come to be known as the Charterhouse. It was here in this quiet house of prayer, surrounded by the chanting of monks and the soft glow of candlelight, that William himself would be buried, and it was here that future generations of de la Poles would rest beside him. William de la Pole died on the 21st of June, 1366. He was roughly 75 years old. An extraordinary age for a man of any station in the 14th century, and particularly remarkable for a man who had lived through imprisonment, financial ruin, and the relentless pressures of royal service. His widow, Catherine Norwich, the daughter of Sir Walter de Norwich, survived him and lived in comfortable retirement with an income of over £200 a year, a very substantial sum that reflected the wealth her husband had accumulated over a lifetime of trade and lending. William de la Pole left behind something more valuable than money. He left behind a family that was no longer merely wealthy. His son, also named William, had been called to Parliament as a knight 5 months before his father's death, a clear signal that the de la Poles had made the leap from the merchant class to the lower ranks of the nobility. The old wool merchant must have died with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his children would move in a world that had been closed to him when he was young. But the true measure of his achievement would only become clear in the next generation, when his eldest son, Michael, would abandon the counting house entirely and reinvent the family as warriors, courtiers, and, for one brief, shining moment, the most powerful men in England after the king himself. Michael de la Pole was born around 1330 in Hull, the eldest son of William and Catherine de la Pole. He grew up in a household that was wealthy but not yet noble, a household where the conversation at dinner would have turned as often to the price of wool in Bruges as to the wars in France. His father was a merchant, and in the ordinary course of things, Michael might have followed him into trade, spending his life on the docks of Hull, counting bales and negotiating contracts. But Michael had no interest in trade. From an early age he was drawn to the world of arms and chivalry, to the mounted knights, the tournaments, the great campaigns in France that defined the age. His father's wealth had opened doors that would have been firmly closed to earlier generations of the family, and Michael walked through them without looking back. He put the merchant life behind him and became a soldier. It was, in many ways, the defining choice of the family's history. By leaving trade for warfare, Michael was declaring that the de la Poles were no longer merchants who happened to be rich. They were nobles, or at least they intended to be. And in the England of Edward III, where the 100 Years' War was the great theatre of ambition and advancement, the battlefield was the surest route to social elevation. Michael's military career began in the great age of English victories in France. He campaigned alongside two of the most famous figures of the era: Edward, the Black Prince, the king's eldest son and the hero of Crécy and Poitiers, and John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the king's powerful and ambitious younger son. These were the men who shaped English policy in France, and Michael de la Pole was in their company, fighting in the campaigns that would define the middle decades of the century. He was twice captured during these campaigns and presumably ransomed, an expensive but not uncommon experience for a medieval knight, and one that did nothing to diminish his standing at court. If anything, it enhanced it, because capture in battle was seen as evidence of courage, and ransom was simply the cost of doing business in the aristocratic world of medieval warfare. But it was not on the battlefield that Michael's greatest rise would come. It was in the court of a young and troubled king. Edward III died in 1377 after a reign of 50 years, and the crown passed to his grandson, Richard II, a boy of just 10 years old. The early years of Richard's reign were dominated by powerful nobles who jostled for control of the young king's government, and as Richard grew older, he began to gather around him a circle of trusted friends and advisors who would help him assert his independence. Michael de la Pole was one of the most important members of that circle. The two men seem to have formed a genuine bond. Richard trusted Michael in a way that he trusted few others. A trust that may have been rooted in the fact that Michael, unlike the great hereditary lords who surrounded the throne, owed his position entirely to royal favour, and was therefore less likely to develop independent ambitions. Michael was loyal, competent, and, perhaps most importantly, he was not a threat. He was the son of a wool merchant, and while he had risen high, he had none of the territorial power or ancient lineage that might make him a rival to the king. In 1383, Richard rewarded this trust with the highest political office in the land. On the 13th of March, Michael de la Pole was appointed Lord Chancellor of England, the Chief Minister of the Crown, responsible for the administration of justice, the management of government, and the execution of royal policy. It was an astonishing appointment. A generation earlier, the de la Poles had been counting wool in Hull. Now the head of the family was the most powerful political figure in the kingdom after the king himself. 2 years later, in 1385, Richard went further. He created Michael the Earl of Suffolk, the first member of the de la Pole family to hold a title of nobility. The earldom of Suffolk had become extinct in 1382 with the death of William de Ufford, and Richard revived it specifically for his chancellor. It was a mark of extraordinary favour, and it cemented the family's position among the great houses of England. From wool merchant to earl in just 2 generations, it was a transformation that had no precedent in English history, and it drew equal measures of admiration and resentment from those who witnessed it. The resentment was important, and it would prove fatal. Michael's rise had been too fast, too dramatic, and too dependent on the favour of a single king. The great hereditary lords of England, men whose families had held their titles for centuries, looked at the de la Poles and saw upstarts, merchants pretending to be nobles, men who had bought their way into a world where they did not belong. This class resentment would fuel the political opposition that would eventually bring Michael down, and it would follow the de la Pole family through every subsequent generation. A reminder that in medieval England, money could buy you a title, but it could not buy you acceptance. Michael used his new status to consolidate his power. He obtained Wingfield Castle in Suffolk through his wife's family, Catherine Wingfield, the daughter of Sir John Wingfield. And this imposing fortress became the family's principal seat, replacing the merchant houses of Hull with a proper aristocratic residence. Wingfield was a statement of intent, a castle of brick and stone that declared to the world that the de la Poles were here to stay. He never forgot his roots in Hull, however. It was Michael who oversaw the construction of the Carthusian priory that his father had planned, the charter house that would serve as the family's burial place for generations. For a brief period in the mid-1380s, everything seemed to be going perfectly. Michael was Chancellor. He was Earl of Suffolk. He was the trusted friend and chief advisor of the king. The de la Poles had completed, in just 2 generations, one of the most remarkable social ascents in English history, from wool merchants to the highest office in the land. But medieval politics was a dangerous game, and the higher you climbed, the further you had to fall. Michael de la Pole was about to discover this truth in the most brutal way possible, because the very closeness to the king that had elevated him was about to destroy him, and the forces that would bring him down were already gathering strength in the shadows of Parliament and the council chamber. The trouble had been building for years. Richard II's government was struggling with the cost of the war in France, struggling with a restless and suspicious Parliament, and struggling with a group of powerful nobles who believed that the king's inner circle was corrupt, incompetent, and dangerously self-serving. At the centre of that inner circle stood Michael de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk and Lord Chancellor, and it was on him that much of the political hostility came to rest. The war with France had gone badly. The great victories of Edward III's reign, Crécy, Poitiers, the conquest of vast swaths of French territory, were fading memories. Under Richard, English forces in France were losing ground, and the cost of maintaining armies across the Channel was crippling the royal treasury. Michael, as Chancellor, bore much of the responsibility for managing the crown's finances, and when things went wrong, he was the obvious target for criticism. There were also deeper tensions at work. Michael had been closely involved in negotiations for a peace treaty with France, a policy that many in Parliament and the nobility considered weak and dishonourable. England had fought for decades to hold its territories in France, and the idea of surrendering those gains at the negotiating table was repugnant to those who believed in the righteousness of the English cause. Michael's willingness to pursue peace was seen not as pragmatism, but as betrayal. In 1386, these tensions erupted in what became known as the Wonderful Parliament. So called not because it was admirable, but because its proceedings were extraordinary and unprecedented. When Parliament assembled, the Commons and a powerful faction of the Lords united in demanding Michael's dismissal and impeachment. The charges were sweeping: embezzlement, negligence, misuse of royal funds, and a general failure to govern competently. Whether the charges were fair or politically motivated is a question that historians have debated ever since. The truth, as is often the case in medieval politics, probably lies somewhere in between. Michael had certainly enriched himself during his time in office, as most medieval office holders did, but the scale of the accusations may have been inflated by his enemies to justify his removal. Richard tried to protect his friend. He resisted the demands for impeachment, insisting that the Chancellor served at the king's pleasure and could not be removed by Parliament. But the political pressure was overwhelming. Parliament threatened to depose the king himself if he did not comply, invoking the precedent of Edward II's deposition just 60 years earlier. Faced with this threat, Richard yielded. Michael de la Pole was stripped of the chancellorship and put on trial. The impeachment was, in many ways, a rehearsal for the far greater crisis that was about to engulf both the king and his closest supporters. Michael was found guilty of the charges against him and removed from office, though the punishment, loss of office and a heavy fine, was relatively moderate by the standards of the age. Richard clearly hoped that his friend would be able to recover, and for a time, it seemed possible. Even after his disgrace, Michael remained close to the king, and Richard made no secret of his intention to restore his chancellor to favour. But the forces arrayed against the king's inner circle were not satisfied with Michael's fall from office. They wanted more, and in November of 1387, a group of powerful nobles known as the Lords Appellant took the extraordinary step of accusing Michael de la Pole and several other members of Richard's circle of treason, the most serious charge that could be brought against a subject of the crown, and one that carried the penalty of death. The Lords Appellant were a formidable group. They included Thomas of Woodstock, the Duke of Gloucester and uncle to the king, a man of fierce opinions and a violent temper, who believed that the crown was being mismanaged by incompetent favourites. Richard Fitzalan, the Earl of Arundel, who had clashed with Michael in the council chamber and bore him a deep personal hatred. Thomas de Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, a veteran soldier who despised the court faction's preference for peace with France. Henry Bolingbroke, the Earl of Derby and future King Henry IV, who was already beginning to develop the political instincts that would one day carry him to the throne. And Thomas de Mowbray, the Earl of Nottingham, a young nobleman whose loyalties shifted with the wind. These were some of the most powerful men in England, and their accusation of treason was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a political coup aimed at stripping the king of his allies and bringing the government under the control of the great magnates. The Lords Appellant raised an armed force and confronted the king's loyalists at the Battle of Radcot Bridge in December of 1387. Robert de Vere, the Duke of Ireland and another of Richard's favourites, was defeated and fled the country. The king himself was humiliated, forced to submit to the appellant's demands, and very nearly deposed. It was a complete and devastating victory for Michael's enemies, and it left the Chancellor's position utterly untenable. Michael knew what was coming. Before the merciless Parliament could assemble in February of 1388, he made the decision that would define the rest of his short life. He fled. Slipping out of England, he crossed the Channel and made his way to Paris, where he sought refuge among the French, the very people he had been accused of being too friendly with during his time as Chancellor. In his absence, the merciless Parliament did its work. Michael was convicted of treason and sentenced to death. His lands were confiscated. His title was stripped. Everything he had built, the earldom, the estates, the political career that had taken him from Hull to Westminster, was gone. He was an exile, a convicted traitor, a man with no home and no country. Michael de la Pole did not survive his exile for long. He died in Paris on the 5th of September, 1389, barely a year and a half after his flight from England. He was roughly 59 years old. The cause of his death is not recorded, but the stress of exile, the loss of everything he had worked for, and the knowledge that he could never return home, must have weighed heavily on a man who had once stood at the pinnacle of English political life. His body was brought back to England and buried at the Charterhouse in Hull, the monastery his father had founded and he himself had built. It was a fitting resting place for a man who had risen so high and fallen so far, and it was a reminder that for all their power, the de la Polees were still, at their roots, a family from Hull. But the story did not end with Michael's death. Parliament had stripped him of his titles and his lands, but it had not, crucially, declared those titles and lands forfeit to his heirs. His son, also named Michael, was still alive, and he was determined to reclaim what his father had lost. The cycle was beginning again. Rise, fall, and rise. It was the pattern that would define the de la Poles for generations to come. A pattern that would repeat itself with almost eerie regularity, each time carrying the family higher and each time exacting a heavier price. The second Michael de la Pole was born in 1367, the eldest son of the first Earl and his wife Catherine Wingfield. He had grown up watching his father's dramatic rise and even more dramatic fall, and the experience seems to have shaped him into a different kind of man. More cautious, more pragmatic, less willing to stake everything on the favour of a single king. When his father fled to Paris and was convicted of treason, the younger Michael was left in an extraordinarily difficult position. He was the son of a convicted traitor, stripped of his family's title, and living under the suspicion of the most powerful men in the kingdom. His father's association with Richard II had made the family a target, and the Lords Appellant who now controlled the government had every reason to keep the de la Poles down. But the younger Michael made a shrewd and fateful decision. Rather than clinging to his father's loyalty to Richard, a loyalty that had proved fatal, he aligned himself with the king's enemies. He cultivated relationships with the Lords Appellant, particularly the Earl of Warwick and the Duke of Gloucester, and positioned himself as a man who could be trusted by the new political order. It was a calculation, pure and simple, a decision to sacrifice his father's principles in exchange for the family's survival. The calculation paid off. Over the next decade, Michael gradually recovered his father's lands and eventually his father's title. The process was slow. It took from about 1389 to 1399. But by the time Henry Bolingbroke seized the throne from Richard II and became King Henry IV, Michael de la Pole had been restored as the second Earl of Suffolk. He had achieved this not through loyalty but through adaptability, and the lesson was not lost on future generations of the family. In the treacherous world of English politics, survival belonged to those who could bend with the wind. The second Earl was a capable but unremarkable figure, a man who served the crown dutifully without seeking the kind of dangerous prominence that had destroyed his father. He fought in France, sat on commissions, attended Parliament, and managed his estates. He married Catherine de Stafford, the daughter of Hugh de Stafford, the second Earl of Stafford, and their marriage produced a large family of at least 8 children, a brood that would include 2 future Earls of Suffolk and 1 future Duke. It was a quiet life by the standards of the age, but it would end in one of the most famous military campaigns in English history, and it would do so in a way that underscored once again the terrible cost that the de la Poles paid for their closeness to the crown. In the summer of 1415, King Henry V, the young, brilliant, and fiercely ambitious son of Henry IV, assembled an army for the invasion of France. It was the beginning of the campaign that would culminate in the Battle of Agincourt, one of the most celebrated victories in English military history. And among the lords who answered the king's call were Michael de la Pole, the second Earl of Suffolk, and his eldest son, also named Michael, who would briefly hold the title of 3rd Earl. Father and son sailed to France together in August of 1415. They landed at the mouth of the Seine and marched to the port of Harfleur, which Henry intended to capture as a bridgehead for his conquest of Normandy. The siege of Harfleur began on the 19th of August and lasted for 5 grinding weeks. The English army surrounded the town and subjected it to relentless bombardment, but the conditions in the siege camp were appalling. The weather was hot, the ground was marshy, and disease spread rapidly through the ranks. Dysentery, the great killer of medieval armies, swept through the English forces, striking down soldiers and nobles alike. Michael de la Pole, the 2nd Earl of Suffolk, was among those who fell ill. He had survived decades of military service, political upheaval, and the disgrace of his father, but he could not survive the marshes of Harfleur. On the 17th of September, 1415, or possibly the 14th, as some sources record, Michael died of dysentery in the siege camp. He was 48 years old. Harfleur fell to the English on the 22nd of September, and Henry V, his army weakened by disease and losses, made the fateful decision to march north toward Calais rather than return home. It was on this march that the English army, now numbering perhaps 6,000 men, found itself confronted by a vastly larger French force near the village of Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt was fought on the 25th of October, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, and it was one of the most decisive English victories of the 100 Years' War. Henry chose his ground carefully, positioning his small army between 2 dense woods that narrowed the field and prevented the larger French force from bringing its full numbers to bear. The ground between the woods was freshly ploughed, heavy with autumn rain, and it became a death trap for the French cavalry. The English longbowmen, stationed on the flanks and protected by sharpened stakes driven into the mud, unleashed a devastating storm of arrows that cut down the French horsemen and men-at-arms as they struggled forward through the mire. The French army, bogged down in muddy fields and crushed by the weight of their own numbers, suffered catastrophic losses. Wave after wave of armoured knights and foot soldiers were driven into the killing ground, trampling each other in the chaos, drowning in their own armour in the churned and bloody mud. It was a triumph that would echo through the centuries, immortalised by Shakespeare and remembered as one of the finest hours in English military history. But for the de la Pole family, Agincourt was not a triumph. It was a catastrophe. Michael de la Pole, the 3rd Earl of Suffolk, the eldest son of the 2nd Earl who had inherited the title just weeks earlier upon his father's death at Harfleur, was among the English nobles who fought at Agincourt. He was a young man, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, newly elevated to his father's title and eager to prove himself worthy of it. He would never have the chance. The 3rd Earl was killed in the battle, cut down in the chaos and slaughter of that terrible day, his body left among the thousands of dead who littered the field between the woods of Agincourt and Tramecourt, father and son. Dead within weeks of each other, one claimed by disease in a siege camp, the other killed on the field of battle. It was a devastating blow to the family. 2 generations of de la Poles wiped out in a single campaign, in a single autumn, in a single corner of France. The Earldom of Suffolk, which the first Michael had fought so hard to win and the second Michael had spent years recovering, now passed to a man who had never expected to inherit it. William de la Pole, the 2nd son of the 2nd Earl, who had been wounded at Harfleur and sent home to England to recover. There is a particular cruelty in the timing of these deaths that deserves a moment of reflection. The 2nd Earl had spent his entire adult life rebuilding what his father had lost. The title, the estates, the reputation that had been destroyed by the impeachment and exile of the 1st Earl. He had succeeded. He had recovered the earldom, served the crown faithfully, and raised a family of capable sons. And then, in the space of 6 weeks, all of that careful work was undone. He died of dysentery in a muddy camp, and his eldest son died on a battlefield, and the family was thrown back into uncertainty and grief. The earldom of Suffolk, which the first Michael had fought so hard to win and the second Michael had spent years recovering, now passed to a man who had never expected to inherit it. William de la Pole, the second son of the second Earl, who had been wounded at Harfleur and sent home to England to recover. William de la Pole was 19 years old. He was now the fourth Earl of Suffolk, the head of a grieving family, and the inheritor of a name that carried both prestige and an unmistakable whiff of misfortune. He would go on to become the most powerful member of the family's entire history, and the one whose end would be the most shocking. William de la Pole was born on the 16th of October, 1396, at Cotton, in Suffolk. A younger son raised in the expectation that his older brother would inherit the earldom and that he himself would make his way in the world through military service and perhaps a good marriage. The deaths of his father and brother in the autumn of 1415 changed all of that in an instant. At 19, William found himself the Earl of Suffolk, responsible for a family that had been devastated by war and a legacy that had been scarred by political catastrophe. He did not have long to grieve. The war in France demanded constant service, and William threw himself into it with a determination that suggests he was driven not only by duty, but by a desire to prove himself worthy of the title he had inherited so unexpectedly. Almost continuously engaged in the French campaigns for the next 2 decades, he served under some of the most capable English commanders of the age and participated in battles and sieges that shaped the course of the 100 Years' War. He fought under John, Duke of Bedford, Henry V's younger brother, who served as regent of France during the minority of the infant king, Henry VI. At the Battle of Verneuil in August of 1424, one of the most significant English victories after Agincourt, he served as a lieutenant and then as a senior commander on the Norman frontier, leading raids, defending garrisons, and managing the complex business of holding conquered territory against a restless and increasingly organized French resistance. By the late 1420s, William had risen to one of the highest military commands in France. When Thomas Montague, the fourth Earl of Salisbury, one of the most brilliant English commanders of the war, launched the ambitious siege of Orléans in 1428, William was his chief lieutenant and second in command. Orléans was a crucial strategic target, and its capture would have opened the road to the heartland of France and potentially ended the war in England's favour. But the siege of Orléans would become famous for very different reasons. On the 27th of October, 1428, the Earl of Salisbury was inspecting the defences from a window at the fortified bridge of Les Tourelles, when a cannonball struck nearby, sending debris flying. A fragment tore away much of his face, and he lingered in agony for a week before dying on the 3rd of November. With Salisbury's death, command of the siege fell to William de la Pole. It was at Orléans that William encountered the most extraordinary figure of the age, a teenage peasant girl from the village of Domremy in the Lorraine, on the eastern edge of France, who claimed that the voices of saints had spoken to her and that God had sent her to save France from the English. Her name was Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc. For William, who had spent his entire adult life fighting in France, who understood the mechanics of siege warfare and the cold calculus of military strategy, the appearance of Joan must have been bewildering. She was everything that a medieval military commander was not. Young, female, uneducated, and driven not by political ambition or feudal obligation, but by a burning religious conviction that defied all rational explanation. And yet, From the moment she arrived at Orléans, she transformed the war. Joan arrived at Orléans in late April of 1429, riding at the head of a small force of soldiers and accompanied by priests and heralds. She carried a white banner embroidered with lilies and the image of Christ, and she claimed that God had promised her victory. The French garrison, demoralized and on the verge of surrender after months of English siege, was electrified by her presence. Soldiers who had been ready to lay down their arms suddenly believed that they could win. Commanders who had been paralyzed by indecision found themselves swept along by the force of her conviction. Joan led sorties against the English positions, rallying the French soldiers with a combination of religious fervour and raw courage that the English had never encountered before. She was wounded by a crossbow bolt during the assault on the Tourelles, but pulled the bolt from her own flesh and returned to the fighting. One by one, the English bastions fell. By the 8th of May, the siege was lifted, and the English army, battered, bewildered, and shaken to its core, retreated in disorder. The relief of Orléans was the turning point of the 100 Years' War. From this moment forward, the tide of the conflict flowed irreversibly in France's favour. And for William de la Pole, it was a humiliation, the beginning of the end of the English dream in France. But worse was to come. He fell back to the nearby town of Jargeau, where he attempted to regroup and hold a defensive position against the advancing French. It was a desperate move. The English forces in the Loire Valley were scattered and demoralized, and Jargeau's fortifications were not strong enough to withstand a determined assault. But William had few options. Retreat meant abandoning the English position in the heart of France, and advance was impossible against an enemy that was suddenly, inexplicably, winning. He chose to stand and fight, but Joan of Arc pursued him, and on the 12th of June, 1429, the French attacked Jargeau in force. What happened next became one of the most celebrated episodes in French military history. William de la Pole, cornered and outnumbered, was forced to surrender. He was captured by a French squire named Guillaume Renaud, a young man of no particular rank or distinction. But William, true to the chivalric code that governed warfare between the nobility, refused to surrender to a common soldier. Instead, in a remarkable gesture, he knighted the young squire on the spot, touching his sword to Guillaume's shoulder and making him a knight, and only then consented to give himself up as a prisoner of war. It was an act of extraordinary grace under pressure, and it has been remembered in French history and literature ever since. William spent several years as a prisoner in France before being ransomed and returned to England. When he finally came home, the war had shifted decisively against the English, and the great conquests of Henry V's reign were slowly unravelling. William had fought honourably and bravely, but the cause for which he had fought was being lost, and the political landscape of England was changing in ways that would carry him to heights and depths that he could not yet imagine. It was during this period, as the military tide turned and the political world of England shifted beneath his feet, that William de la Pole made the marriage that would transform his life and define his family's future. In November of 1430, he married Alice Chaucer, one of the most remarkable women of the 15th century, and a woman whose story deserves to be told alongside his own. Alice was born around 1404, probably at the manor of Ewelmay in Oxfordshire. She was the only child of Thomas Chaucer, a man of considerable wealth and political influence who had served as Speaker of the House of Commons on no fewer than 5 occasions, a record that would stand for 300 years. Thomas Chaucer was himself the son of Geoffrey Chaucer, the great English poet, the author of the Canterbury Tales, and one of the most important literary figures in the history of the English language. Alice never met her famous grandfather. Geoffrey Chaucer had died in 1400, a few years before her birth, but she inherited his sharp intelligence and his gift for navigating the complex world of the English court. Alice had already been married twice before she met William de la Pole. Her first marriage, when she was just 11 years old, was to Sir John Philip, a wealthy knight nearly 25 years her senior. Philip died at the siege of Harfleur in 1415. The same siege that killed William de la Pole's father, and Alice, still a child, returned to her parents' home as a wealthy young widow. Her second marriage was to Thomas Montague, the fourth Earl of Salisbury, the brilliant military commander under whom William de la Pole had served. Salisbury was killed at Orléans in 1428, struck by debris from a cannonball, and Alice was widowed a second time, now one of the richest women in England. Salisbury had left her half of his goods, 1,000 marks in gold and 3,000 marks in jewellery and plate. When Alice married William de la Pole in 1430, it was a union of two people who understood power, loss, and the precariousness of life in 15th century England. William was a war hero with a growing political career. Alice was a wealthy heiress with deep connections to the court and an inherited instinct for political manoeuvring. Together, they became one of the most formidable partnerships in English political life. Alice was appointed a Lady of the Garter, one of the rarest honours that could be bestowed on a woman, and she used her position at court to advance her husband's career and her family's interests with a skill and determination that impressed even her enemies. She became a close friend of Queen Margaret of Anjou, the wife of King Henry VI, and it was through this friendship that the de la Poles reached the pinnacle of their power. The couple had one son, John de la Pole, born on the 27th of September, 1442. And William also fathered an illegitimate daughter, Jane, by a nun named Maline de Kay, a detail that later chroniclers recorded with a mixture of disapproval and amusement. But it was in the political arena that the partnership of William and Alice truly flourished. In 1444, William was entrusted with one of the most important diplomatic missions of the reign: the negotiation of King Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou, the niece of King Charles VII of France. It was intended as a peace settlement, a marriage that would end the long and ruinous war between England and France and bind the two kingdoms together in dynastic alliance. William travelled to France and conducted the negotiations personally. Alice was dispatched as one of the ladies who would escort the young bride to England. The marriage took place in 1445, and for a time it seemed as though William had achieved something extraordinary. Not merely a diplomatic triumph, but a personal coup that placed him at the very centre of royal power. In 1448, Henry VI rewarded William's service with the ultimate mark of royal favour. He created William de la Pole the Duke of Suffolk, a title that had never before been given to a man who was not of royal blood. Until that moment, dukedoms had been reserved for the king's brothers, uncles, and cousins. William was the first commoner-descended man in English history to hold such a rank, and it was a testament to the astonishing journey that the de la Pole family had made. From the wool warehouses of Hull to the highest tier of the English nobility in just 4 generations. But the dukedom, like so many of the family's triumphs, carried within it the seeds of disaster, because the peace that William had negotiated with France was deeply unpopular, and the terms of the marriage settlement were seen by many as a humiliating surrender of English interests. And the higher William climbed, the more enemies he made, enemies who were sharpening their knives in the shadows and waiting for the moment to strike. By the late 1440s, William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, was the most powerful man in England, and the most hated. His dominance over the weak and easily led King Henry VI had made him the effective ruler of the kingdom, but it had also made him the lightning rod for every grievance, every failure, and every frustration that the English people felt about the state of their country. The war in France was being lost. The great English possessions in Normandy, won at such terrible cost by Henry V, were slipping away, fortress by fortress, town by town. The blame for these losses fell squarely on William, who had negotiated the peace settlement and the marriage to Margaret of Anjou. A settlement that, it was now clear, had given away more than it gained. As part of the marriage negotiations, William had agreed to the cession of the county of Maine and the province of Anjou to the French crown. Concessions that were widely seen as treasonous and that had been kept secret from Parliament. At home, the kingdom was in turmoil. The royal finances were in ruins. Corruption was rampant. The commons felt oppressed and overtaxed, and the great nobles of the realm seethed with resentment at a government controlled by a man they considered a jumped-up merchant's grandson. William's nickname, jackanapes, from which the English word for a presumptuous upstart derives, captured the contempt in which he was held by his enemies. In early 1450, the storm finally broke. A close ally of William's, Adam Moleyns, the Bishop of Chichester, was murdered by angry sailors at Portsmouth, and before he died, he allegedly named William as the architect of England's failures in France. Whether or not Moleyns actually said this is uncertain, but the accusation provided William's enemies with the ammunition they needed. Parliament assembled and immediately moved to impeach the Duke of Suffolk on charges of treason. The charges were sweeping and damning. William was accused of conspiring with the French, of plotting to place his own son on the throne by marrying him to Margaret Beaufort, a potential heiress to the crown, and of systematically enriching himself at the expense of the kingdom. Some of the charges were exaggerated, some were politically motivated, and some were probably true. But in the heated atmosphere of early 1450, the truth mattered less than the desire for someone to pay for England's failures. William asked for the right to be heard and was permitted to speak in his own defence. He denied the charges with passion and eloquence, but the mood of Parliament was against him, and a guilty verdict seemed inevitable. The punishment for treason was death, typically by hanging, drawing, and quartering. And William's enemies were eager to see him suffer. It was at this point that King Henry intervened. In one of the few decisive acts of his otherwise passive reign, Henry declared that he would exercise his royal prerogative and determine the Duke's fate himself, bypassing Parliament entirely. The sentence he imposed was exile. William was banished from England for a period of 5 years, with his life and his estates preserved. It was a compromise designed to save his friend from execution without defying Parliament outright, and it satisfied no one. William prepared to leave England, writing a farewell letter to his young son John that has survived to this day. In it, he urged the boy to love and honour his mother, Alice, and to trust in her counsel above all others. He told his son to be diligent in his service to God, to be faithful to the king, and to always act with justice and mercy. It was a tender and private document, the words of a father who feared he was saying goodbye for the last time. And it reveals a side of William that the political charges and the parliamentary debates had obscured. Behind the ambitious politician and the ruthless courtier, there was a man who loved his son and worried about his future. He asked John to be brave, to be good, and above all, to be loyal to his mother, who was, in William's own words, the person who loved John best in all the world. On the 1st of May, 1450, William sailed from the Suffolk coast, heading for France and Exile. His ship, the Nicholas of the Tower, was accompanied by a small flotilla of vessels. The plan was straightforward: cross the Channel, land in France, and wait out the 5 years of banishment in relative comfort. William was wealthy enough to sustain himself abroad, and he had connections at the French court who might offer him shelter and protection. It was not a pleasant prospect, but it was survivable. Or it should have been. But they had barely entered the English Channel when, on the 2nd of May, the Nicholas was intercepted by a larger ship, a vessel that had been lying in wait, its crew armed and ready. Aboard was a group of sailors and men-at-arms who had no intention of letting the Duke of Suffolk reach France alive. What happened next was not a battle, but an execution. A piece of political murder carried out on the open sea, far from the law, far from witnesses, and far from any power that might have intervened. William was seized and brought aboard the larger vessel. The captain greeted him with words that chilled the blood. "Welcome, traitor." Over the next day and night, the crew subjected him to a mock trial, reading out the articles of impeachment and pronouncing him guilty of every charge that Parliament had laid against him. It was a grotesque parody of justice, conducted on a swaying deck by men who had already decided the verdict before the trial began. On the morning of the 2nd of May, William was dragged from the ship into a small boat. An axe and a rusty sword were waiting for him. The Duke was told that if he cooperated, he would be dealt with fairly and die by the sword, a death considered more honourable than the axe. He was ordered to lay down his head. And then one of the sailors, described in the sources as one of the coarsest of the ship's company, took the sword and began to hack at the Duke's neck. It took 6 strokes to sever his head. William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, the first man of non-royal blood to hold a dukedom in English history, died in the grey waters of the English Channel, far from home, far from his wife, far from his son. The sailors stripped the body of its gown and doublet and left the remains on the sands of Dover. Some accounts say that the severed head was placed on a stake beside the body. The corpse lay on the beach for some time before the king ordered it removed. Eventually, William's body was taken back to the family and buried at the Carthusian Priory in Hull, the same monastery his great-grandfather had founded, and where so many de la Poles already rested. Who had ordered the murder was never established with certainty. The sailors who carried it out were likely acting on the instructions of powerful men. Political enemies of William who wanted to ensure that exile was not enough, that the Duke of Suffolk would never return to trouble them again. Richard, Duke of York, William's bitterest rival, and a man with his own ambitions for the throne, was suspected by many, but no proof was ever found. Alice Chaucer, now the Dowager Duchess of Suffolk, received the news of her husband's death with the steely composure that had defined her entire life. She was 46 years old, widowed for the 3rd time, and she had an 8-year-old son to protect. She had lost a husband, but she had not lost her mind, her wealth, or her connections. And in the dangerous decades that followed, decades that would see the eruption of full-scale civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York, Alice would prove herself to be one of the most capable and resilient women of her age, guiding her family through the chaos with a steady hand and a sharp eye for political survival. Her son John was now the heir to the de la Pole legacy. And it was through John, and through the marriage that Alice and events would arrange for him, that the family's destiny would take its most fateful turn of all. John de la Pole was born on the 27th of September, 1442, the only legitimate son of William, Duke of Suffolk, and Alice Chaucer. He was 8 years old when his father was murdered, and the trauma of that event, the shock of learning that his father had been dragged from a ship and beheaded by sailors in the English Channel, must have left a mark on the boy that never fully healed. His childhood was shaped by his mother's fierce protectiveness and political skill. Alice managed the family's estates, navigated the increasingly dangerous political landscape of the 1450s, and ensured that her son was kept safe from the enemies who had destroyed his father. It could not have been easy. The name de la Pole was now associated with treason, with the loss of France, and with the corrupt government of Henry VI. For a time, the family's survival was genuinely in doubt. But Alice was resourceful, and she had a plan. Even before the murder of her husband, arrangements had been made for young John's marriage. In an extraordinary twist of fate, the boy was betrothed to Margaret Beaufort, the daughter and sole heiress of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and one of the most important heiresses in England. The marriage took place around 1450, when both children were about 8 years old. It was, on the face of it, a brilliant match. Margaret Beaufort carried in her veins the blood of John of Gaunt and the Lancastrian royal line, and through her, John de la Pole could have become one of the most politically significant figures in the kingdom. But the marriage was annulled in 1453, likely for political reasons, as the Beaufort inheritance became a pawn in the power struggles that were tearing England apart. Margaret Beaufort would go on to marry Edmund Tudor and become the mother of Henry VII, the first Tudor king. The de la Poles, by contrast, would find their royal connection through a very different route. Around 1458, John de la Pole married again. His new bride was Elizabeth of York, the second surviving daughter of Richard Plantagenet, the third Duke of York, and his wife, Cecily Neville. Elizabeth had been born on the 22nd of April, 1444, at Rouen in Normandy, and she was one of the most well-connected women in England. Her father was the most powerful nobleman in the kingdom and the leader of the Yorkist faction in the civil wars. Her brothers included Edward, who would become King Edward IV, and Richard, who would become King Richard III. Through this marriage, John de la Pole became the brother-in-law of 2 kings. It was an astonishing elevation for a family that, just a century earlier, had been counting wool in Hull. But it was also a dangerous one because the marriage tied the de la Poles irrevocably to the fortunes of the House of York, a house that was locked in a life-or-death struggle with the House of Lancaster for control of the English throne. The Wars of the Roses, as this conflict came to be known, consumed England for the better part of 30 years. A series of battles, betrayals, executions and coups that tore the English nobility apart and left the kingdom exhausted and bloodied. It began in the 1450s with skirmishes and political manoeuvring, escalated into full-scale civil war in the 1460s, and continued in spasms of violence and conspiracy well into the 1480s. It was the most destructive internal conflict in English history since the anarchy of the 12th century, and it consumed the lives and fortunes of virtually every great family in the land. John de la Pole navigated these treacherous waters with a caution that earned him the nickname the Trimming Duke, a label that suggested he was more interested in survival than in glory. Unlike many of his contemporaries who chose sides early and fought and died for their faction, John kept his options open, shifting his allegiance as the balance of power shifted and avoiding the great battles where so many of his peers met their end. It was not a heroic approach, but it was an effective one. While the Duke of Somerset was executed after Tewkesbury, while the Earl of Warwick was killed at Barnet, While countless lords and knights bled out on muddy fields across England, John de la Pole survived. Quiet, cautious, and very much alive. When Edward IV seized the throne in 1461, John supported the Yorkist cause, hardly surprising given that Edward was his brother-in-law. Edward restored the dukedom that had been stripped from John's father, and John became the second Duke of Suffolk. But the rewards were modest. Despite his family connection to the king, John was never admitted to the royal council, never given significant political responsibility, and never treated as a figure of the first rank. He was, as one historian put it, a political lightweight, loyal enough but never trusted with anything important. Part of the problem was money. The de la Poles, for all their titles, were not rich. The murder of William, the first duke, had devastated the family's finances, and the confiscation of estates that followed had stripped away much of the family's landed wealth. John never managed to restore them fully. He tried to build a power base in East Anglia, the region that had traditionally been the de la Pole heartland. But he lacked the resources to compete with the great magnates who dominated English politics. He was among the poorest of English dukes, and his lack of resources limited his ability to play a significant role in national politics. There is even a suggestion that he failed to participate in the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, not out of principle, but because he could not afford to raise and equip an army. But if John de la Pole himself was a modest figure, his children were anything but. He and Elizabeth of York had 11 children who survived infancy, a remarkably large family even by the standards of the age. Their sons included John, the eldest, who would be named heir to the throne; Edmund, who would become a duke and a pretender; Richard, who would spend his life in exile chasing the crown; and William, who would die in the Tower after 37 years of imprisonment. Their daughters married into other noble families or entered the church. An unusually high number of the children, perhaps 4, took religious vows, entering monasteries and convents and withdrawing from the dangerous world of politics that consumed their siblings. And because Elizabeth was the sister of Edward IV and Richard III, those children carried in their veins the blood of the Plantagenets, the royal dynasty that had ruled England for over 300 years. The de la Poles were no longer merely nobles. They were, through their mother, members of the royal family itself. Their grandfather had been Richard, Duke of York, the most powerful nobleman of his generation. Their grandmother had been Cecily Neville, the Rose of Raby, whose bloodline connected them to half the great houses of England. Through their mother, they were nephews and nieces of kings. This would have been a source of immense pride, but it would also prove to be a death sentence, because when the last Plantagenet king fell at Bosworth and the Tudors took the throne, the de la Pole children, with their royal blood and their Yorkist connections, became the most dangerous people in England. They were living reminders that the Tudor claim to the throne was thin, contested, and dependent on the elimination of every rival line, and the new dynasty would stop at nothing to destroy them. Among the 11 children of John and Elizabeth de la Pole, the eldest was a boy named John de la Pole, who would become the first Earl of Lincoln. He was born around 1460, and from an early age he was marked for greatness by his royal connections. His uncle, King Edward IV, took notice of the boy, and in 1467 created him Earl of Lincoln, a title that reflected both his ability and his bloodline. Lincoln, as he became known, was everything his father was not: energetic, ambitious, and politically engaged. He served his uncle Edward faithfully and well, sitting on the royal council and undertaking commissions on behalf of the crown. When Edward IV died suddenly in April of 1483, Lincoln remained loyal to the Yorkist cause. supporting the accession of Richard III, Edward's younger brother and Lincoln's other uncle. It was under Richard III that Lincoln's fortunes reached their zenith. Richard had a son, Edward of Middleham, the Prince of Wales, and as long as that boy lived, the succession was secure. But in April of 1484, young Edward of Middleham died. He was about 10 years old, and his death was a blow from which Richard never fully recovered. The king was said to have been driven nearly mad with grief, the loss of his only legitimate son robbing him not only of a child, but of a future, of the dynasty that he had fought and schemed and killed to build. Richard needed to name a successor, and he chose his nephew, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln. The precise nature of this designation is debated by historians. Some argue that Richard formally declared Lincoln his heir, presumptive at a gathering of lords and bishops. Others suggest that the appointment was more informal, a signal of intent rather than a legal declaration. Some historians have pointed to the fact that Lincoln was given precedence over other possible heirs, including the young Earl of Warwick, who had a stronger claim by blood, as evidence that Richard's choice was deliberate and considered. Lincoln was, by all accounts, the kind of man Richard wanted as his successor, capable, loyal, and old enough to govern if the worst happened. The effect was the same regardless of the formal mechanism. John de la Pole, the grandson of a murdered duke and the great-great-grandson of a Hull wool merchant, was now the recognised heir to the throne of England. He was given authority over the Council of the North, one of the most important administrative bodies in the kingdom, and he was treated at court with the deference and attention that befitted a future king. For the de la Poles, it was the pinnacle of 2 centuries of ambition, from fleeces and counting houses to the steps of the throne itself. It was the highest point any de la Pole had ever reached, and it lasted barely a year. On the 22nd of August, 1485, Richard III was defeated and killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field by Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII. The Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled England since 1154, was over. The Tudor age had begun. Lincoln's father, the second Duke of Suffolk, had not fought at Bosworth. Whether out of caution, poverty, or simple miscalculation, he had stayed away. Lincoln himself had been present, though the details of his role in the battle are unclear. In the aftermath of Henry Tudor's victory, both father and son faced the question that would define the rest of their lives: submit to the new king or resist. Initially, they chose submission. John, the second Duke, swore allegiance to Henry VII and was allowed to keep his title and his estates. Lincoln, too, was reconciled with the Tudor regime, appearing at court and serving on commissions as if the events of Bosworth had never happened. Henry VII, for his part, treated the de la Poles with a wary generosity. He knew that the family's royal blood made them dangerous, but he also knew that openly persecuting them would only drive them into rebellion. Better to keep them close, where they could be watched. But Lincoln's submission was not sincere. Behind the mask of loyalty, he was nursing a grievance and a dream. The grievance of a man who had been named heir to a kingdom and then seen that kingdom snatched away, and the dream of restoring the Yorkist cause and claiming the throne for himself. The second Duke of Suffolk died quietly in 1492 and was buried at Wingfield Church in Suffolk, a modest end for a man who had been the brother-in-law of 2 kings. His widow, Elizabeth of York, survived him and lived on at Wingfield Castle until her own death around 1503. But by the time the Duke was in his grave, the story had already moved on to the next generation, to his sons, and to the bloody reckoning that awaited them. In the early months of 1487, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, made the decision that would end his life. After nearly 2 years of outward loyalty to Henry VII, he fled from the English court, slipping across the Channel to the Low Countries, where he sought refuge with his aunt, Margaret of York, the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy. Margaret was the sister of Edward IV and Richard III, and she had never accepted the Tudor victory at Bosworth. A formidable and intelligent woman, she had married Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, in 1468, and after Charles's death in battle in 1477, she had remained at the Burgundian court, where she wielded considerable influence. From her court at Mechlin in Flanders, she had spent the past 2 years plotting against Henry, funding Yorkist conspiracies, and waiting for the right moment to strike. She was the spider at the centre of a web of exiled Yorkists, displaced courtiers, and disgruntled noblemen who longed for the restoration of the old order. And she had the money, the connections, and the determination to make it happen. Lincoln's arrival gave her exactly what she needed: a credible Yorkist prince, a man with genuine royal blood, around whom a rebellion could be built. The conspiracy that Lincoln and Margaret devised was audacious, cynical, and ultimately doomed. At its centre was a boy named Lambert Simnel, a child of about 10 years old, the son of an organ maker or a carpenter from Oxford, who had been coached by an Oxford priest named Richard Simons to impersonate Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick, the son of George, Duke of Clarence, and one of the last surviving male heirs of the Yorkist line. The real Earl of Warwick was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he had been held since Bosworth, and Henry VII had even paraded him through the streets of London to prove that he was alive and in custody. But Lincoln and Margaret calculated that the impersonation could succeed if supported by sufficient military force, and that once Henry was overthrown, the details of Simnel's identity would cease to matter. The boy was a figurehead, nothing more, a convenient mask for Lincoln's own ambitions. It is worth pausing here to consider what Lincoln's true intentions were. Was he genuinely trying to place Lambert Simnel, a pretender, a fraud, on the English throne? Or was the boy merely a tool, a means to an end, with Lincoln planning to reveal his own claim once the rebellion succeeded? The answer is almost certainly the latter. Lincoln had been named Richard III's heir. He had royal blood. He had every reason to believe that the throne should be his. The Simnel charade was simply the mechanism, the spark that would ignite the rebellion and give Lincoln the military force he needed to march on London and claim the crown for himself. Margaret provided the money. 2,000 German mercenaries were hired and placed under the command of Martin Schwartz, a capable professional soldier. Lincoln gathered further support from Yorkist exiles and sympathizers, and the conspirators set sail for Ireland, where the Yorkist cause still commanded considerable loyalty. In Dublin, the conspiracy reached its theatrical climax. On the 24th of May, 1487, Lambert Simnel was crowned as King Edward VI of England in Christ Church Cathedral. A ceremony attended by Irish lords, English exiles, and the German mercenaries who would soon fight and die for a cause that most of them barely understood. Lincoln stood beside the boy king, lending his presence and his royal blood to the charade. With the coronation complete, the rebel army set sail for England. They landed on the 4th of June at Peel Island, near Furness on the coast of Lancashire, and began their march south. The army numbered roughly 8,000 men, a force composed of the German mercenaries, about 4,500 Irish soldiers who were lightly armed and poorly equipped, and a scattering of English Yorkist supporters who joined along the way. Henry VII had been preparing for this moment. His intelligence network had tracked Lincoln's movements, and he had assembled a royal army of approximately 12,000 men under the command of the Earl of Oxford, one of the most experienced military commanders in England. The two armies converged on the village of East Stoke, near Newark-on-Trent in Nottinghamshire. The Battle of Stoke Field was fought on the 16th of June, 1487, and it was the last major battle of the Wars of the Roses, the final military confrontation between the houses of York and Lancaster for control of the English throne. The battle was fierce and bloody. The Yorkist forces, despite being outnumbered, fought with desperate courage. The German mercenaries, well armed and disciplined, bore the brunt of the fighting and inflicted heavy casualties on the royalist troops. But the Irish soldiers, armed with little more than javelins and short swords and wearing no armour, were cut to pieces by the English longbowmen and men-at-arms. As the battle wore on, the rebel line began to crumble. The fighting lasted about 3 hours, an unusually long engagement by medieval standards. And when the Yorkist ranks finally broke, the rout was terrible. The fleeing rebels were driven down a ravine toward the River Trent, a gully that became known as the Bloody Gutter, and slaughtered without mercy. The casualties among the rebels were catastrophic. Martin Schwartz, the German mercenary commander, was killed. Thomas Fitzgerald, the Irish leader, was killed. Francis Lovell, the Yorkist nobleman who had been one of Richard III's closest allies, disappeared, his fate unknown, though he was rumoured to have drowned in the Trent or escaped to Scotland. And John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, the man who had been named heir to the throne of England just 3 years earlier, was killed in the battle. He was about 27 years old. His body was found among the dead after the fighting ended, and he was buried without ceremony. A far cry from the royal funeral that might have been his if the wheel of fortune had turned differently. He had gambled everything on a single throw of the dice: his title, his lands, his family's future, and his own life. And he had lost. The question that lingers is whether Lincoln ever truly believed in the Lambert Simnel charade, or whether the boy was simply a pretext, a cover story that allowed Lincoln to raise an army and challenge the Tudor king without openly declaring himself a pretender. The answer, most likely, is the latter. Lincoln was a practical man, a man who understood politics and power, and he would have known that a 10-year-old impostor had no real chance of holding the throne. What Lincoln wanted, almost certainly, was the throne itself. The crown that his uncle Richard had promised him, the crown that Henry Tudor had snatched away at Bosworth. Simnel was the flag around which the rebellion was organized, but Lincoln was the man behind the flag, and if the rebellion had succeeded, it would have been Lincoln, not Simnel, who sat upon the throne. But the rebellion did not succeed, and with Lincoln dead, the Yorkist cause passed to his younger brothers, men who were less capable, less charismatic, and less willing to lead, but who carried the same blood and the same name, and who would therefore bear the same burden of suspicion and persecution that had destroyed their eldest brother. Lambert Simnel, the boy king, was captured on the battlefield. Henry VII, in a gesture of calculated contempt, declined to execute him. Instead, the boy was pardoned and put to work in the royal kitchens, a humiliation designed to demonstrate how little the king thought of the Yorkist conspiracy. Simnel would spend the rest of his life as a servant, eventually rising to the modest rank of royal falconer. He died sometime after 1534, a footnote to a story that had consumed the lives of far greater men. The death of Lincoln at Stoke Field was a shattering blow to the de la Pole family. Their eldest son, the heir to the duchy, the man whom Richard III had chosen as his successor, was dead at 27, killed in a rebellion that had failed. And the consequences of that failure would fall not only on Lincoln, but on his brothers, who now inherited both the family's Yorkist claim and the Tudor suspicion that went with it. With Lincoln dead and their father gone, the mantle of the Yorkist cause passed to the next surviving brother, Edmund de la Pole. Edmund was born around 1471, the fifth son of John and Elizabeth de la Pole, but the deaths of his older brothers Geoffrey and Edward and the attainder of Lincoln had thrust him into a position he had never sought and was ill-equipped to fill. Edmund was not a natural rebel. He had no military experience to speak of, no political network, and none of the charisma or ambition that had driven his brother Lincoln to gamble everything on the field at Stoke. He was, by most accounts, a hot-tempered but fundamentally ordinary man. The kind of nobleman who might have lived out his life in comfortable obscurity if history had not placed a target on his back. But history had done exactly that. The execution of Edward Plantagenet, the Earl of Warwick, in November of 1499 was the moment that sealed Edmund's fate, though he may not have fully understood it at the time. Warwick had been imprisoned in the Tower since he was a boy, locked away by Henry VII because his blood, as the son of George, Duke of Clarence, made him a rival to the Tudor throne. For 14 years, Warwick had languished in captivity, growing from a child into a young man who reportedly knew so little of the outside world that he could not tell a chicken from a goose. In 1499, Henry had him executed on a charge of treason, a charge that was almost certainly manufactured, since Warwick had been in the Tower since childhood and could hardly have plotted anything. The execution of Warwick removed the last direct male heir of the main Yorkist line, and with Warwick dead, Edmund de la Pole became the most prominent living Yorkist claimant to the throne. Whether he wanted it or not, his blood made him dangerous, and the Tudors knew it. Henry VII had initially tried to manage the de la Pole threat through a combination of surveillance and controlled generosity. When Edmund's father died in 1492, Henry allowed Edmund to succeed to the Dukedom of Suffolk, a title that carried enormous prestige and that connected Edmund to his grandfather, the murdered Duke. But in 1493, in a deliberate and humiliating gesture, Henry stripped Edmund of the ducal title and demoted him to the rank of Earl. The official reason was that Edmund lacked the financial means to maintain the dignity of a duke. The de la Poles, as we have seen, were chronically short of money. But the real message was unmistakable. The Tudors would not allow the de la Poles to stand on equal footing with the royal family. The demotion was a slap in the face, a public reminder that however high the de la Poles had once climbed, they served now at the pleasure of a dynasty that regarded them with deep and abiding suspicion. For several years, Edmund endured this humiliation in silence. He attended court, participated in royal ceremonies, and gave every outward appearance of loyalty. But beneath the surface, resentment was building. In 1498, Edmund was indicted in the King's Bench for allegedly killing a man in a fury, a charge that may have been genuine or may have been politically motivated. He received a royal pardon, but the incident deepened the atmosphere of mutual suspicion between the de la Poles and the Tudor court. In the summer of 1499, Edmund suddenly fled to Calais. The reasons for his flight are not entirely clear. He may have received intelligence that Henry was planning to move against him, or he may simply have reached the breaking point of his patience. Whatever the cause, his departure set alarm bells ringing at the Tudor court. But Edmund was persuaded to return, and he came back to England and was readmitted to the king's favour. The reconciliation was short-lived. In 1501, Edmund fled again, this time for good. Accompanied by his younger brother Richard, he crossed to the continent and made his way to the court of Maximilian I, the Holy Roman Emperor, at Aachen. There, surrounded by a small circle of Yorkist exiles and sympathizers, Edmund declared himself the rightful heir to the English throne and began the long, ultimately futile process of trying to build a coalition that could overthrow the Tudors and restore the House of York. The consequences of his flight were immediate and severe. Henry VII, now thoroughly alarmed, ordered a crackdown on anyone suspected of Yorkist sympathies. Edmund's younger brother William, who had not fled and who may or may not have been involved in the conspiracy, was arrested and committed to the Tower of London in 1502. He was never tried, never convicted, and never released. He would remain in the Tower for the rest of his life. In the Parliament that met in January of 1504, Edmund, Richard, and William were all attainted, formally declared traitors, with their lands and titles forfeited to the crown. Sir James Tyrrell, a former constable of the Tower who had served as governor of Guienne when Edmund had passed through on his way to the continent, was arrested and executed on the grounds that he had aided the Yorkist fugitive. The net was closing, and anyone who had ever helped the de la Poles was now in mortal danger. Edmund himself spent several frustrating years on the continent, seeking support from Maximilian and other European rulers, but finding that the promises of princes were worth very little when weighed against the realities of international diplomacy. Maximilian, who had initially welcomed Edmund as a useful bargaining chip against England, signed a treaty with Henry VII in 1502, in which he agreed not to support the Yorkist pretender. Edmund was trapped, too important to ignore, too dangerous to harbour, and too weak to act on his own. The end came through one of those accidents of weather and politics that seem, in retrospect, almost too neat to be real. In January of 1506, Archduke Philip of Burgundy, the son of Maximilian and the ruler of the Low Countries, was sailing with his wife Juana of Castile from the Netherlands to Spain when his fleet was struck by a severe storm in the English Channel. The ships were driven onto the English coast, and Philip found himself the reluctant guest of Henry VII. Henry was delighted. Philip was in his power, and the English king intended to extract every possible advantage from the situation. Among his demands was one that Philip could not easily refuse: the handover of Edmund de la Pole, who was being held in Philip's territories. Philip resisted. He was reluctant to surrender a man who had sought his protection, and who might still prove useful in future diplomatic negotiations. But his position was weak. He needed to leave England and reach Spain to claim his wife's inheritance in Castile, and Henry applied relentless pressure. Eventually, Philip agreed to hand over Edmund, but on one condition: Henry must promise that Edmund would not be harmed. Henry gave his word. Edmund de la Pole was delivered to the English and committed to the Tower of London in late March of 1506. He was now a prisoner, but he was alive, protected, at least in theory, by the promise that Henry had made to Philip. Henry VII kept his promise. For the remaining 3 years of his life, he left Edmund in the Tower, imprisoned but not executed. But according to the French essayist Michel de Montaigne, writing decades later, Henry included a remarkable instruction in his will. He told his son and heir, the future Henry VIII, to put Edmund to death immediately after his own death. Montaigne criticized this as an act of moral cowardice, requiring his son to do what he himself would not. Henry VII died on the 21st of April, 1509, and the young Henry VIII, just 17 years old, ascended to the throne. His first act as king was to issue a general pardon, an amnesty that extended to virtually every prisoner in the realm. But three men were explicitly excluded from this pardon: Edmund, Richard, and William de la Pole. The Tudors had not forgotten, and the Tudors had not forgiven. For the next 4 years, Edmund remained in the Tower, his fate hanging in the balance. Henry VIII, despite his father's reported instructions, seems to have been reluctant to execute his cousin. The young king was enjoying the first years of his reign, feasting, jousting, hunting, and basking in the adulation of a court that was overjoyed to be free of his father's miserly and suspicious rule. Henry was, in these early years, a golden prince, generous, charismatic, athletic, and eager to be loved. The cold-blooded execution of a prisoner who posed no immediate threat was not the kind of act that the young Henry wanted to begin his reign with. The de la Poles were a nuisance, not an immediate threat, and Henry may have calculated that a live prisoner in the Tower was less politically problematic than a dead martyr. There was also a practical consideration. Edmund's brother Richard was still alive and free on the continent, and Richard was the more dangerous of the two. A man with military experience, political connections, and the active support of foreign powers. Executing Edmund might provoke Richard into desperate action, or it might encourage other Yorkist sympathisers to rally to the White Rose. Better, perhaps, to keep Edmund alive as a hostage, a guarantee of sorts against Richard's behaviour, a life that could be traded or leveraged in future negotiations. But events on the continent forced his hand. In 1512, France, now at war with England, officially recognised Edmund de la Pole as the rightful King of England. It was a diplomatic provocation of the highest order, designed to destabilise Henry's regime and weaken England's bargaining position in the wider European conflict. By elevating Edmund's claim to the status of an international issue, France had made Edmund's continued existence intolerable. With his brother Richard already in French service and now being promoted as England's true king, Edmund had become a weapon that England's enemies could use against the Tudor crown. A weapon that Henry could neutralise only by destroying it. Henry VIII made his decision. On the 30th of April, 1513, Edmund de la Pole was taken from his cell in the Tower and led to Tower Hill, the small rise outside the Tower walls where generations of traitors and state prisoners had met their end. There was no formal trial, no reading of charges, no opportunity for defence. He was simply brought out and beheaded, a swift, brutal and legally dubious execution that ended the life of a man who had spent 7 years as a prisoner and who had posed no real threat to the Tudor regime since the day he entered the Tower. The timing was not coincidental. England was at that moment preparing for war against France, the campaign that would culminate in the Battle of the Spurs and the Siege of Tournai later that summer. Henry could not afford to leave a potential Yorkist rallying point alive while he took his army across the Channel. Edmund had to die before the king left England, and so he did. Edmund was about 42 years old. His body was buried at the Church of the Minories in Aldgate, London, a modest resting place for a man who had once been a Duke of Suffolk and the leading Yorkist claimant to the throne of England. His wife, Margaret Scrope, survived him by 2 years, dying in 1515. Their only child, a daughter named Elizabeth, became a nun and died of the plague in the same year as her mother at the convent of the Minoresses in London. With her death, Edmund's immediate line was extinguished, but the de la Pole story was not yet over. Edmund's execution had removed one pretender, but it had created another. His younger brother Richard was still alive, still free, and still determined to claim the English crown. And for the next 12 years, Richard de la Pole, the man they called the White Rose, would haunt the Tudor dynasty like a ghost that refused to be laid to rest. Richard de la Pole was born around 1480, the youngest of the 7 sons of John and Elizabeth de la Pole. He had grown up in the shadow of his older brothers, overshadowed first by Lincoln, the golden heir whom Richard III had named as his successor, and then by Edmund, the reluctant pretender who had fled to the continent in 1501. Richard had accompanied Edmund on that flight, and the 2 brothers had spent several years together at the court of Maximilian, seeking allies and dreaming of a return to England that never came. When Edmund was betrayed and handed over to Henry VII in 1506, Richard was left alone. The last free de la Pole, the last active Yorkist claimant, and one of the most hunted men in Europe. He was about 26 years old and he had nothing, no army, no territory, no money of his own, and no realistic prospect of ever setting foot in England again. What he did have was a name, a claim, and a relentless determination that bordered on obsession. Richard's years in exile were a restless odyssey across the courts and battlefields of Europe. He escaped the clutches of Edmund's creditors at Aachen and made his way east, taking service under King Vladislaus II of Hungary, where he established something of a reputation as a soldier of fortune, a condottiere in the Italian style, willing to fight for whoever would pay him and provide him with a platform for his ambitions. But it was France that offered Richard his greatest opportunity. The French kings, first Louis XII and then Francis I, saw in Richard a useful weapon against England. By supporting the Yorkist pretender, France could threaten the Tudor regime without committing to open war, keeping Henry VIII off balance and distracted. Richard, for his part, was willing to be used. He had no illusions about French generosity. The support was transactional, not sentimental, but he had no other options. Under Louis XII, Richard was treated with an equivocal mixture of hospitality and exploitation. He was given a pension, lodged at court, and introduced to foreign ambassadors as the rightful Duke of Suffolk, a title that carried enormous symbolic weight, even if it came with no land, no income, and no real power. The French used Richard's presence as a diplomatic threat, a reminder to Henry VIII that France could, at any moment, recognize and support a rival claimant to the English throne. It was a game of shadows and bluffs played out in the courts of Europe, and Richard was both a player and a piece in this game. A man with agency of his own, but also a tool in the hands of more powerful men. Richard never married. He seems to have understood that a wife and children would complicate his already precarious position, creating additional hostages to fortune, additional people who could be used as leverage against him, additional mouths to feed in an exile that offered no guarantee of income or safety. There were later claims that he fathered an illegitimate daughter named Marguerite, but these come from 17th and 18th century genealogical compilations and have no archival support. As far as the historical record shows, Richard de la Pole died without issue, the last of his line carrying his family's ambitions to the grave. But when the time came for concrete action, the provision of armies, ships, and money for an actual invasion of England, the promises evaporated. Louis was willing to use Richard as a threat, but he was far more cautious about actually committing French resources to a risky military adventure across the Channel. The memory of earlier failed invasions and the knowledge that Henry VIII was a formidable and well-prepared enemy made the French court reluctant to turn threats into action. In 1514, Richard came closer to his dream than he would ever come again. With the backing of France, he assembled an army of 12,000 mercenaries in Brittany and marched them to the port of Saint-Malo, ready to embark for England. It was, for one brief moment, a credible threat. A force large enough to challenge Henry VIII, and potentially ignite a Yorkist rising within England itself. And then, at the very last moment, the invasion was called off. France and England signed a peace treaty, and as part of the agreement, Henry VIII's sister Mary Tudor was married to King Louis XII. The French no longer needed Richard de la Pole, and the army that was to have carried him home was disbanded. Richard was left standing on the docks of Saint-Malo, watching his dream of an English crown dissolve into the Atlantic mist. It was perhaps the cruelest moment in a life filled with cruel moments. To have come so close, to have stood at the head of 12,000 men within sight of the ships that would carry him home, and then to have it snatched away by the stroke of a diplomat's pen. One wonders what Richard thought as he watched the soldiers disperse and the ships sail away without him. Did he rage? Did he weep? Or did he simply set his jaw and begin planning the next attempt, as he always did? Louis XII died in January of 1515, and his successor, Francis I, proved to be a more sympathetic patron. Francis was young, ambitious, and eager to challenge the power of both England and the Holy Roman Empire, and he saw in Richard a useful ally. Richard was welcomed at the French court, given a position of trust, and allowed to maintain his claim to the English crown. During these years, Richard lived a strange half-life, a king without a kingdom, a duke without a duchy, sustained by French money and French promises, and by the stubborn belief that one day, somehow, the wheel of fortune would turn in his favour. He was visited at one point by Pierre Alamir, a German Netherlandish composer and music copyist who was, in fact, a spy sent by Henry VIII and Cardinal Wolsey to gather intelligence on the White Rose. But Richard was no fool. He turned Alamir into a double agent, feeding him disinformation to carry back to England. It was a small victory in a long war of shadows, but it demonstrated that Richard, for all his misfortune, was a man of considerable intelligence and resourcefulness. In 1523, Francis I gave Richard permission to plan a new invasion of England, this time in concert with John Stuart, the second Duke of Albany, the Regent of Scotland. The plan called for a coordinated attack on England from two directions, the French from the south and the Scots from the north, that would stretch Henry VIII's defences to the breaking point and create an opening for a Yorkist restoration. But the invasion, like every other de la Pole scheme, never materialised. The Scots proved unreliable allies, the French were distracted by their own wars in Italy, and the grand plan collapsed before a single soldier crossed the English Channel. Richard was once again left with nothing but his name and his dream. In the spring of 1524, Richard served in the French campaign in Picardy, writing from the field near Terouanne to Louise of Savoy, the mother of Francis I, declaring that everything he had in the world was owing to her. It was a letter of gratitude, but also of desperation. The words of a man who knew that his fate depended entirely on the goodwill of others, and that goodwill could be withdrawn at any time. The end came on a cold February day in Italy, far from England, far from the green fields of Suffolk and the grey waters of the Channel, where his ancestor had been murdered 75 years before. In 1525, Francis I led a large French army into northern Italy to continue his long-running war against the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, for control of the wealthy and strategically vital Duchy of Milan. Richard de la Pole accompanied the king, commanding a division of French troops on the right wing of the army. They were part of a force that laid siege to the imperial garrison at the city of Pavia, waiting through the cold winter months for the defenders to surrender or starve. But the imperial forces did not surrender. Instead, on the night of the 23rd of February, A relief army of roughly 23,000 imperial troops, Spanish infantry, German Landsknechts and Italian soldiers launched a surprise attack on the French camp outside the walls of Pavia. They breached the walls of the great hunting park where the French army was encamped, pouring through the gaps in the pre-dawn darkness, and by first light, the battle was fully joined. The Battle of Pavia, fought on the 24th of February, 1525, was one of the most decisive engagements of the 16th century, and it was a catastrophe for France. The imperial troops broke through the French lines in the early morning hours, and the battle quickly descended into chaos. Francis I, brave to the point of recklessness, charged into the thick of the fighting at the head of his cavalry, scattering his own artillery's line of fire and preventing his guns from targeting the advancing imperial forces. The French cavalry, which had been the backbone of Francis's army, was devastated by the concentrated fire of imperial arquebusiers. The gunpowder-armed infantry who were changing the nature of European warfare. The knights in their gleaming armour who had dominated the battlefields of Europe for centuries were cut down by common soldiers firing lead balls from smoking barrels. It was a glimpse of the future, a future in which courage and breeding would count for less than technology and firepower. The French ranks collapsed, and what had begun as a siege turned into a rout. Francis himself was pulled from his horse, wounded and captured. A humiliation without precedent in French military history. He would later write to his mother the famous line, "All is lost, save honour," though even the honour was debatable. Richard de la Pole died in the thick of the fighting. The exact circumstances of his death are not recorded in detail, but he fell leading his troops, the so-called Black Bands, a force of Landsknecht mercenaries who fought under his command and who wore the Black Cross as their insignia. They were tough, experienced soldiers, men who fought for pay rather than for patriotism, and they held their ground longer than most of the French army. But they were overwhelmed, and Richard fell with them. Cut down on a field in northern Italy, 10,000 miles from the English throne he had spent his life pursuing. He was roughly 45 years old, and he had spent the last 24 years of his life in exile, chasing a crown that was always just beyond his reach. A painting of the Battle of Pavia, preserved at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, depicts Richard's lifeless body lying among the fallen, surrounded by the chaos of combat. An inscription identifies him as le Duc de Suffolk, dit Blanche Rose, the Duke of Suffolk, known as the White Rose. It is, as far as we know, the only image of him that exists. A dead man on a battlefield, identified by a name that was as much a burden as an honour. Richard's body was buried with ceremony in the church of the Augustinians in Pavia. Charles, the Duke of Bourbon, the imperial commander who had won the battle and who was, by the ordinary logic of warfare, Richard's enemy, attended the funeral in mourning. It was a gesture of respect from one soldier to another, and it suggests that Richard, whatever else he may have been, was regarded as a man of courage and honour even by those who fought against him. The reaction in England was very different. When news of Richard's death reached London, King Henry VIII was overjoyed. Bonfires blazed throughout the city. Church bells rang. Cardinal Wolsey led a great procession of clergy to St. Paul's Cathedral, where a solemn Te Deum was sung in thanksgiving. The king rewarded the messenger who brought the news with a generous gift of wine. It was as if England had won a great victory, which in a sense it had. The White Rose, the last de la Pole who had actively sought the English crown, was dead. The Yorkist threat, which had haunted the Tudor dynasty for 40 years, was finally over, or almost over, because there was still one de la Pole left, alive. And his story, though it lacked the drama and the ambition of his brothers' lives, was, in many ways, the most tragic of all. William de la Pole, not to be confused with the earlier Williams in the family, was born around 1478, one of the younger sons of John and Elizabeth de la Pole. He was not an ambitious man. He had not fled to the continent with Edmund and Richard. He had not plotted invasions or sought the support of foreign kings. He had, as far as we can tell, done very little to threaten the Tudor dynasty. But he was a de la Pole. He carried the blood of the Plantagenets. And for Henry VII, that was reason enough. In 1502, William was arrested and committed to the Tower of London. The charge was that he had been involved in his brother's conspiracy, that he had known of Edmund and Richard's plans and had failed to report them. Whether this was true or not is impossible to say, but it hardly mattered. William was not arrested because of what he had done. He was arrested because of who he was. As long as he was free, he was a potential rallying point for Yorkist malcontents, a living symbol of the dynasty that the Tudors were determined to erase. William was never tried. He was never convicted. He was never given the opportunity to defend himself or to hear the charges against him formally presented. He was simply locked in the Tower and left there. Year after year, decade after decade, the seasons turned and the world changed around him, and William de la Pole remained where he had been placed. A prisoner, without a sentence, a man without a crime, held in captivity for no reason other than the accident of his birth. Consider what William endured. When he entered the Tower in 1502, Henry VII was on the throne. The Renaissance was transforming European culture, and Columbus had crossed the Atlantic barely a decade earlier. When he died in 1539, Henry VIII had broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, married 6 wives, and remade England as a Protestant nation. The entire world had changed, and William had seen none of it. He had been a young man of roughly 24 when the Tower gates closed behind him. He was an old man of 61 when he died, grey-haired, forgotten, having spent more years inside those walls than he had spent outside them. The conditions of his imprisonment are not well documented, but we can infer something from what we know about the Tower in this period. Noble prisoners were generally held in relative comfort. They had their own chambers, were served meals, and were sometimes allowed servants and visitors. But comfort is not freedom, and the psychological toll of decades in captivity, with no hope of release and no knowledge of when or if the ordeal would ever end, must have been crushing. William watched from his window as the world turned. He heard the bells of London ringing for coronations, for weddings, for funerals, for victories in foreign wars. He heard them ring for the execution of Anne Boleyn in 1536, for the dissolution of the very monasteries that his ancestors had founded. And he could do nothing but listen and wait and grow old. Henry VII died. Henry VIII came to the throne. Anne Boleyn rose and fell. Thomas More was executed. Jane Seymour gave the king his longed-for son and died in childbed. The monasteries were dissolved. The entire religious and political landscape of England was transformed. The Charter House in Hull, the monastery that William's great-great-grandfather had founded and where generations of de la Poles were buried, was seized by the crown and destroyed. The family's tombs, their monuments, their memory in stone, all of it swept away by the very dynasty that had imprisoned their last surviving son. And through it all, William sat in the Tower, aging, alone, and almost certainly forgotten by everyone except the guards who brought his meals and the clerks who recorded his continued existence in the Tower's records. He never attempted to escape, as far as we know. He never wrote letters pleading for release, or if he did, none have survived. He simply endured day after day, year after year, for 37 years. The longest incarceration in the history of the Tower of London, a record that, as far as we know, has never been broken. He died in 1539. The exact date is not recorded with certainty. He slipped away so quietly that even the chroniclers could not be bothered to note the precise moment. He was roughly 61 years old, and he had spent more than half his life behind the tower's walls. He had committed no crime. He had mounted no rebellion. He had never sought the throne or plotted against the king. His only offence was his name and his blood, and the fact that he was born into a family that the Tudors could not afford to let live. With William's death, the de la Pole family was finished. The male line was extinguished. There were no more brothers, no more sons, no more pretenders waiting in the wings. The family that had risen from the wharves of Hull to the highest reaches of English power, that had produced merchants, earls, dukes, chancellors, military commanders, and royal heirs, was gone. The wool, the money, the titles, the marriages, the battles, the conspiracies, and the executions, all of it had come to this: a quiet death in a stone cell, noticed by almost no one. The story of the de la Pole family is, at its heart, a story about the price of ambition, about what happens when ordinary people reach for extraordinary things, and about the terrible cost that England's political system exacted from those who climbed too high. They began with nothing. A wool merchant from a drowned town on the Yorkshire coast, a man who weighed fleeces and lent money and dreamed of something more. William de la Pole of Hull could not have imagined in his wildest moments that his descendants would one day carry the blood of kings and die chasing the English crown. And yet, that is exactly what happened in a chain of events that stretched across 250 years and 6 generations, from the docks of Hull to the battlefields of France and Italy. Consider the scale of their achievement. In 1300, the de la Poles were nobody. Traders in a port town, men whose names appeared in customs ledgers and shipping manifests, not in the chronicles of the kingdom. By 1400, they were earls. By 1450, they were dukes. By 1484, they were heirs to the throne. No other English family in the medieval period achieved anything comparable. The Nevilles were ancient nobles who rose higher. The Percys were border lords who became kingmakers. The Beauforts were royal bastards who fought their way to legitimacy. But the de la Poles were merchants, men of no birth, no lineage, and no connection to the aristocratic world, who built a dynasty from scratch using nothing but money, intelligence, and an extraordinary willingness to gamble. Each generation rose higher than the last. The merchant became a financier. The financier's son became an earl. The earl's grandson became a duke. The duke's son married a princess. And the princess's sons were named heirs to the throne. It was a rise without parallel in English history. The only time that a merchant family ascended through money and marriage and sheer force of will to the very edge of the crown itself. But each generation also paid a steeper price. The merchant was imprisoned. The earl died in exile. The duke was beheaded by sailors on a boat. The heir to the throne was killed in battle at 27. The pretender was executed on Tower Hill. The White Rose died on a foreign battlefield, and the last brother rotted in the Tower for 37 years. 7 generations, and not one of them escaped unscathed. Not one of them died peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by his family, at the end of a long and contented life. The price of the de la Pole ambition was paid in full, and it was paid in blood. There is a pattern here that is almost too neat, too symmetrical to be accidental. rise and fall, triumph and catastrophe. The same story told over and over again with different names and different faces, but always the same ending. It is as if the family was caught in a cycle that it could not break, drawn upward by ambition and talent, and then dragged down by the very forces that had lifted it. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of the De la Pole story. In medieval and Tudor England, power was not simply a prize to be won, it was a game to be survived. And the De la Poles, for all their remarkable gifts, never quite learned how to survive it. They climbed and climbed and climbed, and each time they reached the top, the ground gave way beneath them. They were, in the end, a family that was always reaching for something just beyond their grasp. The crown, the throne, the final vindication of all that they had built. And that reaching destroyed them. But there is beauty in their story too. Beauty in the audacity of a wool merchant who dared to lend money to a king. Beauty in the courage of a soldier who knighted his own captor before surrendering on a French battlefield. Beauty in the devotion of a duchess who guided her family through decades of civil war with a steady hand. And beauty in the stubbornness of a man who spent 24 years in exile, crossing Europe from court to court, never giving up, never surrendering the dream, even when everyone around him told him it was hopeless. The De la Poles are not the most famous family in English history. They do not have the name recognition of the Tudors or the Plantagenets, the Nevilles or the Percys. But their story is, in many ways, the most purely dramatic of them all, because it contains within it the full arc of human ambition, from the lowest origins to the highest reaches of power, and, from there, to absolute destruction. And now, as the fire burns low and the room grows quiet, let their story settle into your mind, like the last embers of a winter hearth. They are gone. The merchants, the earls, the dukes, the pretenders, all of them. Their castles have crumbled, their tombs are silent, but their story remains, and it is a story worth remembering. A story of how far a family can rise and how far it can fall in the turning of a few generations. Rest well, sleep softly, and we will see you by the fire again soon. Good night. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a quiet like and a gentle subscribe help these stories find others who need them. Thank you and sleep well.